For those who don't know me, just a very short introduction. Apologies for everyone who was here last week. I don't want to bore you at all, but let me be quick. So I've been in EdTech education for the past 10, 15 years, worked at Relics and Pearson, big companies globally from London, mostly across multiple markets. So I'm quite used to bringing new propositions to new audiences in cultures that are not mine. So really understanding how do you enter a new market, how do you work with that market dynamic on the ground is what I've been doing quite a long time now. I moved to Australia, although I'm in the Netherlands as we speak. I moved to Australia a couple of years ago, and I've been helping education, technology startups and scale-ups with their go-to-market, either entering new segments within Australia, the Australian markets, or looking how to go abroad. So I've got quite a few examples that I'll show throughout, or that I talk about throughout this presentation. If you have any questions, as Alex already mentioned, please drop them in the chat box and I'll talk through whatever your question is about throughout the presentation. So today it's really building on what we've done last week, what we've talked about last week. Last week we talked about how to assess what market to go into next. And this is, okay, once you've assessed that, how do you go into that market? What do you need to prepare to make sure that your launch into that market is successful? So developing an international go-to-market strategy. This is what I want to discuss with you in this hour. Analyzing your market we've done mostly last week. The one point that we didn't touch on last week was analyzing your competitors, which I'll do in this session a bit more. Then it's about researching your audience and the commercial strategy. So first, a question to you, and that is your target audience the same in other markets than it is in the market you're in now, or that next new market you want to move into? And obviously, the first answer is yes, of course. They live in a different country and very often they speak a different language. But other than that, if you look at it and you think about it, are there other characteristics that you know of already that are different from the market you are active in today? Do you know that already, or? Alex, I lost the chat bot for some reason.
Oh, okay. I've still got it here. So Nathan said, oh no. Nathan said yes, teaching style. Carolyn said yes, mostly. Nathan said China versus Australia's teaching styles are quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So yeah, everyone feel free to respond to Vinny's questions on the chat box as she asks them, and I can relay them back to her.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And indeed, I mean, teaching style is very often very different in each country you move into, which has obviously a knock-on effect on your product itself.
Kang also says students also have different attitudes towards teachers.
Interesting one. Yeah, very interesting. Let me go back to the teaching style. So it has an impact on your product and how you structure your pedagogy, etc. But it also always impacts your teacher training and the support that you need to arrange to go into a market, which is very often very different from the market you're already in. It has to do with language very often, but also how you approach someone. In many cases, not all, they want to have at least the feeling that support is near them. They struggle often with time zones, etc. So those are things to think about when moving into other countries and other markets, and when putting your new proposition to that market in place. And then students have different attitudes towards teaching. Absolutely. The difference between, for instance, Asia and the Nordics in Europe is just completely different. In terms of that, in Asia, a teacher is very often, there's an hierarchy. So they look up to a teacher, and they really think that the teacher knows it all, and that is something that is very important in that culture. Whereas, for instance, in the Nordic countries in Europe, a teacher is almost treated like a friend, and there's sometimes not that much respect even, which makes the way you teach very different, but also the way you help that teacher. So in your go-to-market, you help that teacher be successful. So that's spot on type of characteristics to take into consideration when drafting or creating your go-to-market strategy. Then before you even start really looking at your persona or the person who starts buying or using your product, before that there's really a job to do about segmenting your new market. Very often, and we spoke about that last week, but for the people who weren't there, if you assess a market, you find out what segments are in those markets, how do school years end and begin, what are the levels in the other countries in terms of teaching and learning, and mapping that out is very, very important. And what you then find is that when you start segmenting, you find that you can start with quite a few, you end up with quite a few segments that you think are opportunities. But what I would really strongly advise is pick one segment first. And a segment can be really well defined, like primary schools in urban cities, and then maybe even just, if you go, for instance, into China, just pick one or two cities rather than all of them. Primary schools in the public sector who are Catholic, or so you try to really narrow it down so you have a very well defined segment. And once you have that, and once you know, okay, this is the segment with the highest opportunity, so that all comes out of your assessment work, then you start thinking about your persona. And most companies have personas already, and many of those companies have personas for their product, which is absolutely, well, needed, because you want to know who you have in mind when creating your product. But when I talk about personas, I really talk about a go-to-market persona. So figuring out who is the buyer, who is the influencer, and who is the decision maker. And the product persona is very often based on the user, which is also very important. And also in your go-to-market, you need to think about that persona, absolutely. But from a go-to-market perspective, it's even more important to really understand who is actually paying for this product and who's influencing that purchase and who's in the end making the decision. Can
I just ask, Vinne, what type of strategies do you have for figuring out who these people are? Do you kind of identify the school segment, then do research on those schools' individual websites? Do you go onto LinkedIn? How do you identify these people, especially, I guess, when they're overseas?
Well, the best way is you do some desk research. You always start with desk research. You ask some people on the ground. And then two ways really, really work. One is go to a few conferences on the ground, because that's how you really you see who is just browsing, who is asking the buying questions, and then you figure out, okay, but what's the job title of this person asking that? So that gives you really good feel for it. And then lastly, always talk to a few prospects that you have identified. Okay, this could potentially be good target audiences. Get into that school or university, depending on who your target audience is, or company if it's corporate learning. Get into it just with a market research hat on, and saying, well, I'm developing this, I'd like you to be involved. Can I ask you some questions? And that's how you start. It's almost a snowball within that organization, whether it's a school or a university or a company, where you figure out, okay, so you're the user of these type of products, but who is actually making the decision? Oh, that's that person. Can I talk to that person? So you have almost a stakeholder map of your first few schools or companies to figure out who's involved in this. Always talk to a few people. Don't assume. That's really what I've learned. And it only need to be around 5 to 6 people. It doesn't have to be a million people or something like that. You need to get a feel for it. But it's a very good question, and leads me to, this is a persona canvas. I'll touch base on that later on. It leads me to the next step you need to take, and that's mapping out the customer buying journey. So you need to figure out, okay, who's your persona, who makes the decisions, etc., and what are their characteristics, but also what journey do they go on when making this decision, or when making the decision, or when you create buy-in. That whole journey you need to map out. And this is an example of an SaaS solution, an Australian SaaS solution, who sells a platform to principals and business managers. They are the key decision makers, and then it's used by teachers, the platform. And what they find is that it's almost always a combined decision. So a principal doesn't make the decision without the business manager, and vice versa. And the business manager can also be a CFO. So it's a bit a hybrid kind of role. And what we've done for this particular company, and like I did last week, I made a bit, I erased what I can't share, but I tried to give you a bit of a feel for what steps to use for your own company. So what we've done for this particular organization, we've spoken to quite a few principals and business managers to understand what steps do you go through during buying these type of solutions. And these type of organizations go through, or for this particular product, go through awareness, interest, consideration, intent, purchase, usage, and then they start spreading the word. That's basically the next phase after that. And then we looked at, okay, what steps in their mind do they take? So a principle in awareness is really about recognizing that they have a problem, whereas a business manager finds out at that stage that there is a problem. So someone tells them there is a problem. So, and that's a very small nuance, but it's very important, because if someone tells you there is a problem, you're less connected to it than when you actually recognize you have a problem. Because when you recognize you have a problem, you're invested and you want to start solving it. And in your whole messaging and the way you approach those different personas, you need to think about that, because you can be quite, in this particular example, you can be quite explicit about your solution quite quickly with a principal in this case, whereas with a business manager, you really can't yet, because someone just told them there's a problem, but they don't feel they have a problem yet. So you need to start really working with them about, okay, where is that problem and how can this problem make your life miserable if you don't solve it quickly? So that's why this customer journey, buying journey, is really important to dive into the details to understand how do you talk to someone, to your persona, at what stage. And that message changes during the journey. So once you've identified the steps, you look at how do they feel? Are they confused or are they annoyed and stressed? And that also tells you how to speak to someone. And then you can go into more detail. What are they thinking and what are they actually doing? Which informs you in terms of, okay, if they think X, we can say Y to make sure that they don't feel as stressed as they do. Mapping this out for your particular solution really gives clarity in terms of, okay, this is how I can market my product during the whole cycle that they go through. Now, I'm just going back to the persona canvas. So this is a canvas I often use, and I change it a little bit depending on the company I work with, obviously, and the target audience. I mean, when you start speaking to people, you start recognizing things that are really important for that particular target audience. But thinking about it, you need to look at their demographics, obviously. What's their occupation? Where are they based? What school type, number of students, staff, that kind of thing. So, and that's really about the segment. But then you dive into what's their personalities, and that really informs you in terms of how do you speak to this person. Are they, if it's, and that's very often the case in education technology, are they digital savvy? And that's important to know. Nonetheless, in terms of how do you need to support them in terms of teacher training, etc. What are their goals and needs? What are their pains? Quotes you hear back from them. Always make it quite lively. And then you start figuring out, okay, how do they search for solutions, which you eventually can use in your channel mix, which people are involved in the purchase, and what are their considerations. So these are typical things I want to really understand when I speak to someone to nail down the persona for my solution. Any questions so far? Okay, so the risk, cool, thanks Caroline. The risk with this is that you either end up with a persona that is far too generic, because you speak to every person is always unique, obviously. So when you speak to everyone and then you try to summarize it, and then the persona becomes too generic. The other risk, though, is that for each and every person you speak to, you want to create a different persona, and then you end up with 20 million personas. And trying to get that balance right, that is art, basically. That's really gut feel and trying to understand, okay, this is good enough. Now we tackle the real problem in this persona, and now we need to move on to the next one. And that goes back to your segmentation. And that is a back and forth thing. And you don't have that 100% right the first time you do it. And you don't have to, because you learn more and more the further you go. What I would absolutely recommend, if you work with personas and a customer journey and you go live or you go into a market, always update whatever you've created, because at one point you want to reuse it again and then it's outdated and you haven't actually collected what you've learned. And then basically your learnings are lost, or only in your mind or the person who's working that market. And that's a pity. That's lost intellectual property. Cool. So if there's no questions on this, and this is really the research piece, then we dive into product. a very important and the starting point of your go-to-market, obviously. And this is less about your product features and what it does, etc. It's more about how the product is perceived and how you want to market your product. So let's start with the product market fit. Sometimes, yes. So here we start with the competition, which also is part of your assessment when assessing a market, but it goes, this is really one level down, and very often, same with personas actually, competition is looked at very detailed from a product point of view, but not necessarily always from a go-to-market / marketing point of view. And when looking at your competition from a go-to-market point of view, you really need to look at what brands are out there, what's the brand footprint, if you like. So how strong are other brands? And very often when you go into a new market, there is a local brand that it's well known. So how do you handle that? Look at their marketing strategy and their sales strategy. Look at their marketing tactics, execution, and sales execution. Just figuring out how many boots your competitor has on the ground is very often already an eye-opener, because that tells you what either investment you need to do to be as strong as your competitor, or if you don't want to do that investment, or for other reasons you don't have it, or how can you outsmart them. But knowing that type of information is absolutely crucial. So that's from a competitor point of view, the value proposition. So this is always what I use for the value proposition, is a canvas, and I can share the link if anyone is interested. And I'll talk you through an example of one of the products I was responsible for when at Pearson, which was called My English Lab. And that's basically a platform that helps students and teachers practice their English language skills and assess where they're making progress and where they are not. So for this particular example, I'm using a university teacher in Japan. He is a male Australian from background, and he's 40 years old. He is teaching at that Japanese university, and he's teaching English as a second language. His main job is to make sure that students are engaged, so they progress in their studies, and they hit their pass rates. He personally really wants to make a promotion, and he wants to keep his job. He feels, so the pains that he feels constantly under time pressure. He has far too much admin to do. Students aren't motivated, so he's afraid to lose his job. He sees low pass rates, which makes that fear of losing his job even higher. And there's not many promotion opportunities. And he finds technology quite difficult. So those are all his pains. But the gains from his job are he loves having respect from his students. He loves the opportunity he might have to be promoted and become a real professor in his field. He loves the student interaction that gives him energy, the respect from his peers, and he actually really likes teaching and the ability to travel, because that always comes with the ESL job. People can travel anywhere and can do that job anywhere in the world. So that's the university teacher and his pains and gains and what he wants to get out of his job. Now, what does that mean for My English Lab? As I said, it's an online assessment tool, and one of the big benefits of it is automated grading. And how does this product relieve the pains from this university teacher? Well, it's automated reporting, so that saves him time. It offers a good user experience, so he doesn't have the feeling that he's really dealing with technology, and makes it easier for him. The platform has proven that it improves learning outcomes when teachers and learners use it, and it saves him time. Game creators. So because of when he's using this, he has more time to teach, which is actually his passion, because he has needs less time to assess his students, and he has more student interaction, which is the reason why he even took this job. So the value proposition here is really by using this online assessment or automated grading tool, he gets happy students and he gets increased promotion chance because they perform better, their learning outcomes are going up. So this is a quite easy canvas to use, which really nails down what are the real USPs of your product that you can match to your persona. And again, I'm talking about the persona that you want to speak to. So if this is the persona of the user, in this case, how do we then talk about this user to the actual buyer, who might be the principal of a school, for instance, who doesn't teach himself? So then the whole story is about, okay, they're saving time, so it's more efficient, which is saving you as a principal costs, for instance. Or the other angle, we are seeing that it improves learning outcomes, which makes your school as a school a better school, and you can promote your school under new students or new parents and teachers as a best performing school by using this technology. So those are angles that you can then take. So ultimately, it's about the product market fit, product persona fit. And this tool is just quite easy to use. Having said that though, just filling it out doesn't give you the answer. You still need to think about, okay, how do I then, when I know this, what elements do I take out to really start creating my message and my value proposition message? And for creating a value proposition message, that's not done within a day. That is really churning and churning and churning and throwing things out and starting over again. And then all of a sudden you have the real message that really tells your unique story of your product and that resonates with your target audience. Questions so far? And this is just one example. I've got many more examples, but I always think that these kind of canvases start to resonate a bit better if you see an example. Obviously, all the examples are different. So if you start plotting your own product and your own persona, you'll see a completely different canvas coming through.
Do you find it helpful, Vinne, to put together a canvas initially of your ideal customer and see how much, after you talk to a potential customer, that aligns with your ideal customer, as a way of, I guess, just kind of finding out whether or not it's worth pursuing that person? Or do you find it helpful to just start by talking to the customer and seeing what their profile kind of is?
Yeah, I always find it helpful to start almost with a blank canvas, just to speak to people, because then you speak to them a bit unbiased as well, and you hear more. And then from that, you start to draft up your ideal customer. My experience very often is that if you do it the other way around, is that you hear what you want to hear.
Okay. Yeah, that's I think that can be a problem often. Kang's also just asked, is anyone here, or have you even had any experience dealing with parents' personas? Are they a lot more diverse than, say, teachers or principals?
Yeah, I've got a lot of experience with them, and in many different countries. Yeah, they are diverse depending on what your segment is. So if you're, for instance, in the private sector, very high up. Well, specifically in some Asian markets, but also South America has really elite schools. There you see that the parents they all have a profile, but they are quite similar to each other. Whereas if you have a public school, for instance, it's very diverse. Parents come from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and the way you need to talk to them but also help them is very different. So it depends a bit which segment you're in, but it can become quite messy, that part, yeah, especially when they are the purchaser. So when they are just on the receiving end of your solution, so you sell to a school who then just uses it and teach, or parents are using it because the school just offers it, then again, you need to really think about the parent, because the parent can be a difficult stakeholder for your client or customer. But when you have a product that you sell to parents directly, then it's a whole different story, and you really need to do research. Because their buying journey is completely different altogether. Oh, good, thank you. Okay, let me move on. Then, in terms of product market fit, the third element to think about is your brand. And what I often come across is that people seem to think that a brand is a logo, but a brand is much more than that. It's about the identity, it's about your tone of voice. Obviously, design is part of it, and it's about how do you consistently talk as a company, and all your employees, when you start to become bigger, need to talk that same language. And that can be quite challenging. But it's massively important, especially if you move into a country where they have an established local brand. Thinking about how your brand, so not only your product and your features and how you are unique compared to that other competitor, but also about your brand. How does your brand speak differently to your target audience than your local competitor does? Because they know nuances that you might not know. So try to make your weakness a strength by using that your product, for instance, is created in Australia. I mean, many countries look up to Australia, so that can really be a benefit. And using that in your messaging and in your brand can be useful, but you need to be very conscious in what you do and what you don't do in terms of branding. And then lastly, in terms of product market fit, is your pricing. And we touched on that a little bit last week, talking about the Conjoint and the Van Westendorp. Janet said, well, there are going to be 3 other sessions run by EduGrowth specifically on pricing, so I won't go into detail. The only thing I would want to say about this is choose the strategy that fits your market. So really assess the pricing that's already in that market and think about, okay, is that cost-based? Is that based on competition, or is that willingness to pay? And if you have a chance to go the third route, I would really strongly advise that, because the margins are highest in that, with using that. So that's the product side of the go-to-market. And obviously, As a big disclaimer, and I think I said that last week too, a go-to-market is a massive piece of work. So I can just only take the highlights and show the process. But each and every step you take takes quite a bit of effort. It probably seems easier than, or sounds easier than when you start really actually doing it. Then once you've solved your product and your pricing, so you know your proposition, you know what you go to market with, you need to think about your promotional efforts. And just a curiosity, what has been your best performing campaign so far? If you want to share that.
Mine personally has just been from like personal connections. So reconnecting with an educational, I haven't gone overseas as of yet, but I've connected with an educational institution that I went to that is connected very well globally. So it's called Trinity College, and they've got a big footprint in the Asia Pacific. So that's kind of, I guess, my early stage. By doing business with them early, my hope is that I'll be able to leverage kind of their captive audience in the Asia Pacific.
Yeah, very smart. So it's almost a partnership model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conferences I read.
Yeah, so it seems most people are kind of haven't really launched yet.
Okay. Okay, so well, if you haven't, there's not much to base it on. If you have, yes, personal meetings, it's conferences. Okay, good to know. Then building on what's working for you in Australia is always something that I would suggest, because that's where your strong suit is. Whereas if you try to do something completely different in another market, you almost need to build new capabilities out. So starting with that is always the preferred way to go. And then when you start learning or starting to understand that new market, you start to learn which other type of campaigns work there. Some markets, for instance, are very discount. They like discounts. Others just don't. They want to always get more for what. So they don't like the feeling of getting a discount, but they like to have the feeling, okay, I'm getting even more for what I've purchased, which is basically the same thing, but in their mind it's different. And trying to understand what works and what doesn't work in a country will help you to launch the best campaign for your company in that market. And conferences and personal meetings, as everyone has already raised in the chat, are the way to find that out, really. So one of the key things that I always say, try to find a local partner. Even if you decide in the long term you don't want to work with them, it just gives you a very good kickstart into a market and really understanding that market and the nuances of that market. So I'm just reading use. Yeah. So working with partners locally is a very, very good way to get into it and to understand the nuances. Elements to think about, apart from the hard selling ones in finding a deal right away through personal connections or conferences, is think about, okay, what will your message be in that country? And thought leadership, especially in education, is a key element to explaining why you exist. and why you think you are improving the learning experience, learning outcomes, student well-being, depending on what angle you're taking. Explaining that really well and engaging, so choosing that theme, engaging key opinion leaders in that field, and engaging leading publications locally, and collecting evidence of that what you're saying is really true, especially in an area like education, is key, because people who are in education are all in it for a reason. They're passionate about what they do, and they want to believe in doing good, and they want to believe in that what you're doing helps them doing good. So telling that story is really, I think, the core of your whole campaign plan. If you don't have that story, all your campaign efforts, if you do digital marketing, or if you go to millions of conferences, or if you reach out to all kinds of personal contacts who then try to introduce you elsewhere, if you don't have that story clear and you don't have others backing that story, it's going to be a difficult one. So once you have that story, and for instance, one of the companies I've just worked with in Australia, they are really keen on improving efficiency in schools, and they have proved that once you do that, that actually improves learning outcomes, which is an angle that's not, I mean, improving learning outcomes, everyone says that they do it, but actually what drives that improvement, that's not that easy to really drill down on. And efficiency is not one that is taken very often. It's very often because the pedagogy is better, or because we help teachers be better. Those kind of angles are taken, but efficiency isn't. So talking to key opinion leaders in a university has helped that organization to start measuring what the part of efficiency really drives learning outcomes, and doing some academic studies to build on that and to prove that helps that organization to have conversations with other key opinion leaders, and that's how the story starts spreading. So that's one of the examples, but it's quite important to have that. And then once you have that, it really starts to become clear to you as well what type of campaign angles you can take. For instance, for this particular company product, what we've looked at, okay, if the key pillars are efficiency and learning outcomes, what are the campaigns that we can run? So one campaign that we've run, for instance, is how to make your school more efficient, and then we created a calculator where they can put in what they're doing now, and then we can show them what they can do to improve that efficiency. So that's one angle, for instance. The other angle is around student engagement. So if your school is more efficient, your teachers have more time to engage with students, which improves learning outcomes. So that was all around student engagement, that campaign. And then that campaign theme needs to run through all your channels. So each channel you touch, if it's your conferences, if it's your outreach, so directly talking to your personal contacts who then pass you on to someone else, the theme that you connect to people about always need to go back to that specific campaign. So there's consistency, and then going back to your brand that we just touched on, consistency in your brand too, so that the new market starts to understand what you're about and how you differentiate against what's already in that market, specifically what local competitors are in that market. Any questions on the campaign angles and how to approach those steps.
I guess I've got a question around, like, I said increasing publications, and could it start somewhere, maybe even a bit simpler, like on your LinkedIn or something like that, writing some articles? What do you think's the best kind of first steps if you're just kind of starting out, trying to begin formulating that campaign theme?
Absolutely. Start with your own channels and be consistent with everything that you put out there. So LinkedIn, Facebook is very often a good channel in many markets if you want to reach teachers, or specific local channels. I mean, WeChat for China, for instance. So that depends a bit per market where you're going to. So absolutely, you need to be consistent with your own messaging. But in terms of thought leadership, it is very important to get others on your side. Because you preach your own story, and that's all fine, and that's fantastic. But if someone else who's very credible starts saying the same thing, and even if they don't mention your product, that doesn't matter, because you can then start quoting them and start making the connection. Then it becomes more credible.
Do you want, and sorry, just to ask an extension question, with crafting this kind of campaign, do you think, say you're putting out content or articles, do you think it needs to directly relate back to your product in each article, or could it be like a wider thought piece to almost begin to position yourself as a thought leader and engage with a wider audience? What do you find is a better strategy?
A better strategy is if it's wider. And that people start to understand, okay, these guys are always about efficiency. And many of the tips that we give, for instance, in this particular example I gave, have nothing to do with the platform we're selling. But they just know, okay, these guys are really thinking about how to make a school more efficient. And then they start talking about you. And then in your back pocket, well, actually, we have this solution, might help you too. And then the whole selling isn't as hard as it is if you just call. And you need to do both. You also need to do cold calling and say, hey, guys, I have this solution, please buy it. It's a mix of things. But once people start to get to know you for a specific thing, they go to you with questions. And you become a trustee for them. And that's how sales, longer term sales, sustainable sales, happens.
I guess I'll just ask one more question.
Yeah,
I guess we kind of live in this clickbaity age where, like, you know, to get people really kind of getting onto your, I guess, content, a lot of people say, do these 4 things to improve efficiency. You know, would you recommend trying to make clickbaity titles, or try to make it more kind of academic based prose or casual prose? What's your thoughts on that? And then Nathan's also just asked, would you recommend building up a personal brand as well?
Yeah, so let me just ask or answer your question. I think you can do all of it. So you can have some short ones with, well, clickbaity, but because you do know that the people who click on that are interested in efficiency in this case. And then once you have a conversation with them, you can start getting them further down the funnel. And if you can then provide them with a more academic article about backing up those 4 tips, that makes the story even more credible. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's a mix of things, because you just reach different people in different ways. And some people respond better to short form and have that longer conversation later down the funnel. And then a personal brand. And Nathan, do you mean a personal, like Nathan is the personal brand, but do you mean, is that your question? Yeah. If you are the face of a company, absolutely. If you're not, if you're more in the background and you're more the operator, then you don't have to. Then it's probably more the personal brand of the people who are more frontline, like for instance your BDMs or etc. But yeah, people do business. Eventually, people do business with people. So they want to know that the person that they're dealing with knows what they're talking about. And if that's you, if they all know that you are behind that company or product, then it's definitely recommendable to make sure that people understand what your thoughts are. If it's not, then you need to think about how can your frontline people, BDMs, or sometimes someone appoints a chief learning operator, for instance, or a chief academic, then that person will have to build up that personal brand. Cool. Okay, I think we only have 5 more minutes. So we've got the product price, you know what your campaign, your promotional activities will be, and then how are you going to promote it? Which channels are you going to use? And this is, here everything comes together. So you combine your audience with the message and the channel. So you look at your audience again, which you have in your persona. But you also start using this now to target in, for instance, media or conferences, etc. You look at your proposition, so your message and your key USPs, and then you choose your channel. And by reading through the chats a little bit just now, I reckon that most of you use sales rep, and that sales rep can be yourself making the connections in this case. So that's then your channel, and that's a very, very important channel, especially in B2B. So treat it as a channel. So understand what costs, what budget do you need to really properly build up a sales rep channel. What support material do they need, and how can you make sure that sales rep gets in front of the people that they need to get in front of? Digital can help you with that. In some business models, digital even is the sales channel, especially if you, for instance, market to parents directly. Very often that's the case. Some market to students if the students are a bit older. If they go for corporate learning, for instance, then the student can be the purchaser. So then digital becomes also your sales channel. But if you use it for B2B activities, it's always a supportive channel. It's not the only channel you can use. Outreach works really, really well. If you target well, especially in education, it's quite easy to get good lists because ministries just publish all the schools in markets, so you can just find someone to find the right contact details or scrape it. Conferences and events are incredibly important but very expensive. So choose the right ones for that. And also what I've learned throughout the years is be very creative in that. You don't necessarily need a stand to be visible at a conference. You can do all kinds of creative stuff to make sure that people start recognizing you regardless of whether you have a stand or not. And then if you go into a new market, partnerships and distributors, if you have a if you have a physical component to what you do, distributors are crucial. even more so in some markets where there are regulations where you can't be physically dealing with customers yourself, like for instance China, but also Vietnam has quite strict rules around that, and Argentina. And that's all channels you need to consideration and take into consideration and figure out how much effort do you put against what channel, and their budget really comes in. So that's the last piece, really calculating what resources and what media budget do you need for each channel to get the right mix. And then you start, and then you test, and you measure, and then you optimize it again, because the first channel strategy is never the right one. And very important for education is looking at seasonality. When do you push what? Because some markets in some months just don't buy, as you all well know.
And Carolyn's just quickly asked, there are a couple of trade missions later this year. I think she's referring to the ones in India, but they're quite expensive. Do you think you need to go that road?
Well, it's a good question. I would always ask myself first, am I capable to go into India? Am I at that stage yet? Because if you meet someone there and there's an opportunity, how do you follow up then? So that's the first question. If the answer is yes, and you've done your market assessment and India is high on your, came out high, then absolutely it's worthwhile to make the connections, because the first thing you need to try to get really when moving into a new market is have a partner there, some kind of partner, because it's almost impossible to go into markets all on your own. Some markets are obviously a bit easier, like the UK. We talked about that last week. And the US to a certain extent. But if you go into Asian markets, if you go into Middle East or Latin America, it's really tough to do that on your own without any local knowledge. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any other questions on channel? Nope. Then, I just wanted to finish, and I just said it already in my answer to Caroline, is find local partners. It's, I think, the first, so once you've assessed your marketing, you know which one you want to go in first. I would say your first next step is to find someone local that you can deal with. Even if it's just someone that you know who isn't really in your field, but can put you in touch with others who are, to do some market research, and then the ball starts rolling, etc. I think if you are thinking about launching into a new country from Australia without any connection to that country, you have a very high likelihood to fail if you do that. Whereas if you have local partners, they can warn you for all the difficulties and the opportunities as well in the markets you're going to.
This might be the last question, but Kim's just asked, do you recommend joint ventures with overseas markets?
Yes, and not with all. Very often you can work with a distributor, for instance. But in China, definitely JV is a good way to go. India, not necessarily. No, not necessarily a JV. You have different ways of working with them. Especially they are. There are so many opportunities in India. So it's quite easy to you are almost what they want instead of the other way around. So they start to compete against each other if your product and your proposition is good. They're so eager to market. So a JV, because a JV is very good legally, and it gives you, it's the right way of going about a market like China, where the legalities are so incredibly local. India is very different, and especially with the educational system, much based on the UK system. It's a different, you don't have to do it with a JV, because it's also, it's also cutting opportunities for you when you go into a JV. So it's not necessarily the only way to go. Cool. Any other questions? Nope. Cool. Well, then I want to thank you all. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And otherwise, I hope to see you sometime in person. And Kim and I will already, we're starting to try to get a date in the diary. Lovely to see you all.